Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to be talking about my current thoughts related to what you might want to set your retiring interval to if you're using the retirement add-on. So roughly a week ago I uploaded a video called Card Retirement, the Role of the SRS Part 2, where I go pretty in-depth into the logic behind the retirement add-on. And so if you haven't seen that video, this video is probably not going to make that much sense because I'm going to be using a lot of terms and concepts that I introduced in that video. So I'll put a link to that in the description. Also, if you need any help setting up the retirement add-on in a kind of technical sense, I also have a tutorial on how to do that. So I'll put a link in the description to that video as well. And I also just gotta give a kind of disclaimer because everything that I'm gonna say in this video is theory. It hasn't really yet been reality tested. And the reason for this is that the retirement add-on is new. We just created it, and as far as I know, nothing like the retirement add-on has really existed up until now. I mean, you could argue that WaniKani kind of has a built-in retiring interval, but I don't really think that that's going to be useful for our purposes. And so until we actually gather some empirical data related to the retirement add-on after people go and use it for a while, we can't really know for sure what are the best retiring intervals and how do we know what retiring interval is going to be best for each person. So this is my speculation related to my current understanding of how the SRS works and how language learning works, and I'm pretty confident in this theory, otherwise I wouldn't be making a video about it at all. But you still just got to take into account that these haven't actually been reality tested yet, so don't take them as dogma. Got to take it all with a grain of salt, and always trust your own experience when experimenting with these type of things. So with that out of the way, I think that there's two main categories of factors that you want to take into account when considering what retiring interval you should use. So one of those is what your current level is, and the other one is your immersion diet. So related to your level, this is pretty straightforward. It's just basically that when you're a beginner, you're going to be learning common words that are used very frequently. And as you get more and more advanced, you're going to be learning less and less common words that are used less and less frequently. And the more common a word is used, then the smaller the organic interval is going to be, and therefore the smaller retiring interval you would need to retain that word. And so when you're a beginner, in general, you're going to want to have much smaller retiring intervals because you're learning words that are very common and therefore have small organic intervals. But on the other hand, you also got to take into account the fact that when you're a beginner, your listening skills aren't that great, your reading skills aren't that great. And so a lot of the words you're coming across in your immersion are actually just going over your head, right? They're just kind of going in ear, one out the other, and you don't notice them. And so this is important to think about because when we're talking about organic intervals, we're really talking about your subjective experience, not objective reality. So if you know a word and you have an SRS card for it in your immersion, and it's a very common word that's coming up actually once every few minutes, but because your listening abilities are really poor at the beginning, you don't notice it every few minutes, you only are able to notice it once every few days, let's say, then for you, the organic interval of that word is a few days, not a few minutes. Because if you don't notice it, if your brain doesn't actually realize that it heard that word and doesn't recall what the meaning of that word was, then to you, it was like you just didn't see it. It didn't exist. And so when we're talking about resetting your internal intervals by coming across words in your immersion, we're talking about what you're able to notice. So basically, when you're a beginner, you're learning really common words that are coming up all the time, but you kind of got to artificially subtract some points from that because even though these words are coming up all the time, you might not be noticing them all the time. And so there's that. On the other hand, as you get more and more advanced, you're learning rarer and rarer words that are showing up in your immersion less and less often, but less goes over your head, so you don't really have that to worry about. And so in general, I would say that, the closer you are to being a beginner, then the shorter retiring interval that you're going to want to have. And as you get more advanced, then the longer retiring interval you're going to have. But the difference between these two ends of the spectrum might not be quite as extreme as you might think at first, because in the beginning, things are going over your head. And as you get more advanced, they're not. You're noticing almost everything you come across. So there's that. And the other main category of factor, like I said, is then your immersion diet. And so there's two factors within this category. One of them is the quantity of your immersion, and the other one is the diversification of your immersion. So regarding the quantity of your immersion, this is really straightforward. Basically, the more immersion you get each day, then the smaller your organic intervals are going to be, and then the smaller retiring interval you're going to want to have. So if you just imagine that there's two different people, person A and person B, and they're at the same level and they use the same type of immersion sources, yet a person A immerses for 2 hours a day and person B immerses for 1 hour a day, then obviously person A is going to be coming across words twice as often as person B because they're getting twice as much exposure to the language, which means that their organic intervals are going to be half the size, which means the retiring interval can be half the size. And so the more immersion you do each day, the smaller your organic intervals are going to be, and the smaller retiring interval you're going to be able to get away with. So that's really straightforward. The other factor is how diversified your immersion is. And this pretty much only applies to advanced learners. But again, just to give an example to make this clear, let's say that we have two learners that are both pretty advanced, but one of them only consumes romance dramas and romance-related fiction novels, and the other person likes to consume a wide range of different types of immersion, like novels, nonfiction books, documentaries, fiction shows, YouTube videos, and comedy, and a whole large range of different type of content. So the person who only consumes fiction related to romance, by the time they become an advanced learner, they're already going to know almost all the words that tend to be used in romance-related content. But every once in a while, depending on the specific work that they're reading or watching, there's still going to be words that come up that they don't know. So, for example, if they're watching a romance drama and one of the characters likes to play war-related video games, and that's a decent portion of the plot, it's somehow related to the plot, and so every once in a while you hear this war terminology because one of the characters is using it when he's talking about the video game that he plays. You're not going to know that because even though you might have watched a ton of romance shows, war-related vocabulary probably just didn't come up for you up until that point. And so let's say you make cards to learn that war vocabulary, and that's great, except if you stick to only watching romance shows, it's going to take a really long time for you to come across that war terminology again, if you ever do, right? Which means that for the new words that you're learning as an advanced learner who does not have very diversified immersion, you're going to have very large organic intervals and therefore need to have a very large retiring interval. Whereas on the other hand, if we're thinking about that person who has very diversified immersion sources, that person, if they come across a war terminology in a piece of fiction, then they're likely to maybe see it in a nonfiction book they're reading where war is brought up, or a documentary where war is brought up, or the news where war is brought up. And so they're much likely to come across that word somewhere else in a different type of immersion and therefore reinforce it. So basically, the more diversified your immersion is, the more different domains of language you regularly expose yourself to, then in general, the smaller your organic intervals are going to be, and the smaller your retiring interval can be. So that's another just factor you need to take into account. How diversified is your immersion? The more diversified, then the shorter your organic intervals. So really, those are all the factors I think that you need to be taking into account. Just to go over them again. So basically, you have your level. When you're a beginner, you're learning very common words, which are going to naturally have small organic intervals, which means you can have small retiring intervals. Whereas once you start to get more advanced, then you're going to be learning words that are not very common, which means they naturally have large organic intervals, which means you want to have a large retiring interval. But you also have to just take into account the fact that as a beginner, stuff's going over your head, and so the difference might not be as stark as you might think at first. And then, of course, the more immersion that you do, then the smaller your organic interval is going to be, and then also the more diversified your immersion is, the smaller your organic intervals are going to be. And so now I'm going to actually go into some actual numbers, but you got to just remember that these are kind of just generic numbers that are going to apply to the average person. And so you got to take all these factors into account and maybe nudge them a little bit in either direction in order to match your level and immersion diet. And also, I'm going to be kind of assuming that these numbers are going to work for someone who probably gets around an average of 3 hours of active immersion each day, and then an additional couple of hours of passive immersion. And so if you are doing more immersion than that each day, then you want to make the intervals even smaller. And if you're doing less, if you're only doing 1 or 2 hours of active immersion each day, then you probably want to make these retiring intervals a little bit bigger. So basically, because one of the biggest factors related to what your retiring interval should be is your level, right? Or in other words, how common are the words that you're learning, I decided to come up with 3 different potential retiring intervals depending on how common the words are that you're currently learning. So basically, I think that if you're learning words that are between 0 and 1500 on a frequency list, so basically if you're learning words that are part of the most commonly used 1500, then you can probably get away with having a retiring interval of 3 months or 90 days. So if you have a vocabulary of less than 1500 and you're still just learning the most common words in the language, then I think 3 months is a very conservative potential retiring interval. I think that's going to be more than enough time, because even though a lot of stuff's going to be going over your head, if you're getting 3 hours of immersion a day, then you're going to notice each of these common words that you're learning at least once in your immersion in the course of that 3 months. I actually think that's a very conservative interval, and I talked about that in my last video. But then if we're moving on and you're learning words from the 1500 range to the 5000 range on a frequency list, so these words are significantly less common. They're going to be showing up significantly less than the first category. So I think then you can double the retiring interval to 180 days or around 6 months. So once you're learning words in this range, then I still think that this is super conservative and super safe, but now you're going to wait 6 months until you get rid of your card, or you're going to wait until you can remember the word for 6 months without the card before you get rid of it. And then once you're learning words in the range of 5K and above, so on a frequency list, you're learning words that are past the 5,000th most common word, then you probably want to set your retiring interval to a whole year just to be safe. And so there you have it. I'll put these numbers in the description as well. Now, I don't mean to imply that you should be learning with a frequency list, like just taking a frequency list and going down the list in order, learning all the words. I think that it's best to just learn words as they happen to come up in your immersion in I+1 sentences, and as words happen to draw your attention and you happen to notice them in your immersion. I think that learning naturally and letting your brain kind of lead the way is going to lead to the smoothest, most efficient process, and that trying to just artificially game the system with a frequency list is actually going to make you lose efficiency. But because naturally, if you just follow your brain kind of has a built-in frequency list. It just naturally notices the most common words first. And so if you just learn things as they grab your attention, you're going to be learning in an order similar to frequency anyway. And so the reason why I'm using frequency in these numbers is that not because, like I said, I want you to learn them in the order of frequency, but just every once in a while, you can grab a frequency list and look up some of the words that you've learned recently and just kind of get a feel for how common or uncommon are the words that you've been learning. And so most of the time, spend most of your days without looking at a frequency list, but every once in a while, you just pull it up and then you can see, okay, so these words are in the 500 range. These other words I was learning were in the 700 range, so I'm still learning common words, right? And then maybe a few months later or many months later, you do this thing again, and then you realize, oh, so now I'm learning words in the 1600, 1700, 1800 range, and then you know, okay, I've that kind of bumped up a level, let me make my retiring interval longer. And so that's the way I recommend using a frequency list. Now, I will talk about frequency lists more in the future, because I actually think that if you're an advanced learner and you're learning very uncommon words, then it is a good idea to check the words that you're learning with the frequency list before you decide to learn them. And that if they're above a certain point, like if they're above 60,000 on a frequency list, probably just skip it, because that's an extremely uncommon word that you might never come across again for the rest of your life. And most Japanese people probably don't know. But I never really recommend learning with a frequency list, like just going down a frequency list and learning the words in order. I only use it as a kind of reference, like in the ways I've been talking about, just to make sure that a word isn't too uncommon, or to just get a feel for what your vocabulary is right now and the words that you're recently learning, where is their position on a frequency list. And so I think it can be useful for those situations. So that's all I really have to say at the current moment. Thanks for watching. I'm really looking forward to hearing your guys' experience with the retirement add-on, and maybe I'll make a kind of update video in 6 months where I will kind of be going over what I have heard related to people's experiences and either updating or confirming what I talked about in this video. So thanks again. Talk to you next time, guys.